Alberta received a frantic call from neighbor Mrs. Patterson at 11:30 p.m. during thunderstorm. Grandfather Walter being forcibly removed from family home by Alberta's father Roger after living there peacefully for 8 months following ranch sale. Alberta rushed through pouring rain to witness 82-year-old grandfather clutching single suitcase soaking wet, while Roger screamed about freeloading and my house now. Grandfather's confused, heartbroken expression as lightning illuminated scene. Alberta's shock discovering father's true nature after grandfather sold beloved Montana ranch for $5 million specifically to ensure family care during final years. I couldn't believe what I was witnessing as I pulled into the driveway of my childhood home. The rain hammered against my windshield so hard I could barely see through the chaos unfolding in front of me. There stood my 82-year-old grandfather Walter clutching a worn leather suitcase that had probably been with him since before I was born. His thin frame shook not just from the cold October wind, but from something deeper that made my heart crack wide open. My father Roger stood in the doorway, his face twisted with an anger I had never seen before. The porch light cast harsh shadows across his features, making him look like a stranger rather than the man who had taught me to ride a bicycle in this very driveway 20 years earlier. Water dripped from Grandpa's gray hair onto his flannel pajama top, and his bare feet were pushed into house slippers that offered no protection against the growing puddles. This nightmare had started 6 months ago when Grandpa made what we all thought was the most generous decision of his life. His 4-generation family ranch in Montana had been struggling financially for years, and at his age, maintaining the property had become impossible. The McCready Ranch had been in our family since 1893, spanning over 3,000 acres of some of the most beautiful grazing land in Big Sky country. When Grandpa announced his decision to sell, he gathered our entire family in his living room on a warm April Sunday. I remember the way sunlight streamed through his kitchen windows, casting golden rectangles across the worn hardwood floors. He had made his famous blueberry pancakes that morning, and the smell still lingered in the air as he cleared his throat to speak. The buyer was a development company looking to create a luxury resort destination, and they offered exactly $5 million for the entire property. Instead of keeping the money for himself or distributing it among his children and grandchildren, Grandpa did something that stunned us all. He decided to give every single penny to my father as an early inheritance with one simple request that seemed reasonable at the time. Take care of me during my final years. Grandpa had said, his weathered hands folded in his lap. I don't need much. Just a place to belong, family dinners, and someone to talk to when the loneliness gets too heavy. Roger had immediately agreed, his eyes probably already calculating how that money would change his life. He promised to build a separate apartment addition onto his house, complete with its own entrance bathroom and small kitchen. He talked about weekly family dinners, fishing trips, and even mentioned converting part of his garage into a workshop where Grandpa could pursue his woodworking hobby. Roger's wife Sandra had nodded enthusiastically, talking about how wonderful it would be to have Grandpa close by, how their children could learn from his wisdom, and how they would make sure his golden years were filled with love and respect. The whole conversation felt warm and hopeful, like we were creating a beautiful new chapter for our family. But as I stood in that driveway watching my grandfather shiver in the rain, I realized that every single promise had been nothing but lies wrapped in false smiles. During those first few weeks after the ranch sale, everything seemed to go according to plan. Grandpa moved into the guest bedroom temporarily, while Roger supposedly arranged for the home addition. The money had been transferred into Roger's account, and Grandpa seemed genuinely happy about his decision. He would sit at their kitchen table in the mornings, sharing coffee with Sandra and helping their youngest daughter with her homework. However, instead of beginning construction on Grandpa's living space, Roger had apparently been busy spending the inheritance money on other priorities. I learned later that within the first month, he had purchased a brand new boat worth $60,000. The gleaming white vessel sat proudly in their driveway, complete with fishing equipment that Roger had never shown interest in before. Then came the Hawaiian vacation in June. Roger and Sandra spent 2 weeks on Maui staying at a luxury resort and posting pictures of themselves on pristine beaches, while Grandpa remained alone in their house. When they returned, Roger had also somehow acquired a new Ford pickup truck, cherry red, with all the premium features worth another $45,000. During those months, I had been working long hours at my marketing job and dealing with my own challenges, so I only visited occasionally. Whenever I called to check on Grandpa, Sandra would answer cheerfully and assure me that everything was wonderful. She would mention how much Grandpa was enjoying his new living situation and how they were still finalizing plans for his permanent space. The first sign of trouble came in August when Grandpa called me directly, which was unusual since he typically went through Roger or Sandra for family communication. His voice sounded different, smaller somehow, and he asked if I could visit soon because he had some concerns he wanted to discuss. When I arrived that weekend, I immediately noticed changes that made my stomach tighten with worry. Grandpa had lost noticeable weight, his clothes hanging loose on his already thin frame. The guest bedroom where he was staying looked cramped and temporary, with his belongings packed into 2 small boxes rather than properly arranged like someone planning to stay long-term. During our conversation, Grandpa carefully shared some troubling details about his daily life. Roger had become increasingly critical about small things, like leaving lights on too long or using too much hot water during showers. Sandra had started measuring his food portions, claiming they needed to budget carefully, despite the millions of dollars Grandpa had just provided. Most concerning, they had begun discouraging his longtime friends from visiting, saying the house was too busy for frequent guests. But I had dismissed these concerns as simple adjustment challenges. Multi-generational living arrangements always required some negotiation and compromise. I encouraged Grandpa to be patient and suggested he speak directly with Roger about his needs. Looking back, I realize I was naive to trust that my father would honor his commitments to the man who had just made him wealthy beyond his wildest dreams. Now, watching Grandpa clutch that pathetic suitcase in the rain, I finally understood the truth. Roger stepped closer to the doorway and shouted something about freeloaders and property ownership that made my blood boil. Sandra appeared behind him, her arms crossed, nodding in agreement with whatever horrible words were coming out of his mouth. I jumped out of my car and ran through the downpour toward them. "What is happening here?" I demanded, positioning myself between Roger and Grandpa. "Why is he standing outside in this weather?" Roger's face was flushed with anger and something that looked like guilt mixed with defiance. "This is my house now, Alberta. I make the decisions about who lives here and who doesn't. Your grandfather has worn out his welcome." The lightning illuminated Grandpa's face at that moment, and I saw an expression of complete heartbreak that I will never forget. This was a man who had worked every day of his adult life to build something meaningful, who had served his community, raised his children with love and discipline, and in his generosity had trusted his son to care for him when he was most vulnerable. That was the moment I realized my father was not the man I thought he was, and that Grandpa's worst fears about depending on others had just come true in the most cruel way imaginable. Mrs. Patterson appeared at my shoulder, her gray hair soaked from the rain, but her expression fierce with protective anger. "I've been watching this shameful display for 20 minutes," she announced loudly enough for the neighbors to hear. "Walter is coming home with me tonight, and tomorrow we're going to figure out what kind of people treat family this way." As I helped Grandpa into my car, his hands trembling as he fastened his seatbelt, I made a silent promise that this betrayal would not be the end of his story. Roger had made the biggest mistake of his life, and he had no idea what was coming. The real estate documents I discovered tucked under Roger's boat seat the next morning would prove that his cruelty had been carefully planned all along. Taking Grandpa to my small apartment felt like the most natural decision I had ever made, even though it meant imposing on my roommate Jennifer and creating complications for everyone involved. Jennifer had been my friend since college, and when I explained the situation while we helped Grandpa settle into our living room that first night, she immediately began rearranging furniture to create a comfortable temporary bedroom space for him. Over the next several days, as Grandpa recovered from the shock and humiliation of being thrown out, I started investigating exactly what had happened to the money he had given Roger. What I discovered was a systematic pattern of financial exploitation that went far beyond the luxury purchases I already knew about. My first breakthrough came when I offered to help Grandpa organize his important documents. He had managed to grab a small folder during his hurried departure, and as we went through the papers together, several disturbing discrepancies became obvious. Bank statements showed that Roger had been accessing Grandpa's personal savings account, which was separate from the ranch sale money, using a power of attorney document that Grandpa did not remember signing. Over the course of 4 months, Roger had systematically drained $12,000 from that account through weekly withdrawals of $500 to $800. When I asked Grandpa about these transactions, he had no knowledge of them and certainly had not authorized Roger to use his personal savings for any purpose. Further investigation revealed that Roger had also sold Grandpa's antique furniture collection without permission or consultation. These pieces had been in our family for generations, including a handcrafted dining table that Grandpa's father had made in 1922 and a mahogany armoire that had belonged to his grandmother. Roger had apparently contacted an estate sale company in July and sold everything for $3,800, telling them that he was cleaning out deceased family property. When I confronted Roger about these transactions by phone, his reaction was telling. Instead of expressing surprise or offering explanations, he immediately became defensive and angry. "That old furniture was taking up space in my garage," he said. "Walter wasn't using it anymore, and I needed room for my boat equipment. Besides, the money went into the household budget, so it benefited him too." But the most disturbing discovery came when I helped Grandpa review his health insurance situation. Roger had canceled Grandpa's supplemental health insurance policy in September, claiming it was too expensive and unnecessary since Medicare would cover basic needs. The premium was only $240 per month, an insignificant amount considering the millions Roger had received, but the cancellation left Grandpa without coverage for prescription medications, dental care, and several other essential services. During our conversations about his living situation with Roger and Sandra, Grandpa began sharing details that painted a picture of deliberate emotional abuse designed to make him feel unwelcome and burdensome. Roger had started criticizing him for minor infractions like forgetting to turn off lights or taking too long in the bathroom. Sandra had begun commenting on his eating habits, suggesting that he was consuming more than his fair share of groceries and should consider eating smaller portions to be more considerate of the family budget. Most cruelly, they had systematically isolated him from his social connections. When his longtime friends called to arrange visits, Sandra would answer the phone and explain that Walter was napping, not feeling well, or that the house was too chaotic for guests that day. After several weeks of these excuses, most of his friends stopped calling altogether, assuming that he preferred privacy during his adjustment period. Roger had also begun making threats about alternative living arrangements whenever Grandpa expressed any dissatisfaction with his situation. "Remember that there are state facilities for people who can't appreciate family generosity," Roger would say during arguments. "Maybe you would prefer a nursing home where they can handle your complaints more professionally." These threats were particularly effective because Grandpa, like many people his age, harbored deep fears about ending up in institutional care where he would lose all autonomy and dignity. Roger understood this fear and wielded it as a weapon to ensure Grandpa's compliance with increasingly unreasonable demands. When I called family attorney Thompson to discuss legal options for protecting Grandpa's interests, I learned another disturbing detail about how Roger had manipulated the original agreements. Thompson explained that Grandpa had been recovering from minor gallbladder surgery when Roger brought him the documents to sign for the ranch sale and money transfer. The surgery itself had been routine, but Grandpa was still taking pain medication that affected his mental clarity during the recovery period. Thompson had been uncomfortable with the timing of the document signing and had suggested waiting until Grandpa was completely recovered, but Roger had insisted that the real estate deal required immediate action to avoid losing the buyer. "Your grandfather was not fully alert during that meeting," Thompson admitted to me during our phone conversation. "He seemed confused about some of the details and kept asking repetitive questions about the arrangements. I should have postponed everything until he was completely lucid, but Roger assured me that they had discussed all these plans extensively beforehand." Thompson had apparently felt uneasy enough about the situation to document his concerns in his file notes, but Roger had pressured him not to delay the transaction. The real estate company was legitimate, and the sale was properly executed, but the circumstances around Grandpa's decision-making capacity raised questions about whether he fully understood the implications of giving away his entire inheritance immediately. But the most shocking revelation came from my roommate Jennifer, who worked part-time for a private investigation company that specialized in corporate fraud cases. She had been quietly researching Roger's financial activities using her access to public records databases, and what she discovered explained his sudden urgency to get control of Grandpa's money. Roger's construction company was facing a federal audit due to irregularities in their pension fund management. Employee retirement contributions had been improperly invested in high-risk ventures that had resulted in significant losses, and the audit was expected to reveal a shortfall of over $400,000. Roger, as the company's majority owner, would be personally liable for replacing those missing funds. Jennifer showed me documents indicating that Roger had been using portions of Grandpa's inheritance money to cover the missing pension contributions, essentially laundering stolen retirement savings through his father's generosity. The timeline matched perfectly with when Roger had started becoming impatient and hostile toward Grandpa. He needed access to more cash to continue covering his tracks before the federal investigators completed their review. This discovery changed everything about how I understood Roger's motivations. He had not simply been ungrateful or gradually lost patience with having an elderly parent in his home. He had deliberately manipulated a vulnerable man in order to use him as an unwilling source of funds for covering up his own criminal financial mismanagement. The cruelty of throwing Grandpa out in the rain was not an emotional outburst, but a calculated decision by someone who had already gotten what he needed and no longer wanted to maintain the pretense of caring. Roger had literally used his own father as a tool for avoiding federal prosecution, then discarded him like garbage when maintaining the relationship became inconvenient. As I tucked Grandpa into the makeshift bed we had created in our living room that night, I promised him that we would find a way to hold Roger accountable for his crimes. I had no idea yet how extensive the web of corruption really was, but I was determined to protect this gentleman who had spent his entire life building something meaningful, only to have it stolen by someone who should have been his greatest protector. The evidence Jennifer and I were gathering would soon reveal that Roger's betrayal was even more calculated and vicious than we could have imagined. Working with Harold Martinez, Grandpa's closest friend, for over 30 years opened up entirely new avenues of investigation that revealed the true scope of Roger's deception. Harold had been suspicious about the sudden changes in Grandpa's availability and mood, but had assumed that family dynamics were simply complicated during the living arrangement transition. Harold owned a small accounting firm and had actually helped Grandpa manage the ranch finances during its final years, so he understood better than anyone how significant the $5 million sale had been. When I shared what we had discovered about Roger's behavior, Harold immediately offered to help document everything that might be useful for potential legal action. Our first major discovery came when Harold accessed casino records using his professional connections. Roger had been gambling regularly at 3 different Indian casinos within driving distance of his home, often losing thousands of dollars in single evenings. The gambling had clearly escalated after he gained access to Grandpa's money, with some individual losses reaching $8,000 on weekend trips. Harold's investigation revealed that Roger owed significant amounts to various creditors even before receiving the inheritance. His construction business had been struggling for over 2 years, with several clients filing complaints about incomplete projects and poor workmanship. He had borrowed against his house maxed out multiple credit cards and even taken cash advances against business equipment to keep his company operating. The inheritance money from Grandpa's ranch sale had temporarily solved Roger's cash flow problems, but instead of using it responsibly to rebuild his business and pay down debt, he had treated it like lottery winnings. The boat truck vacation and gambling losses had consumed over $200,000 within 6 months, with no productive investments or debt reduction to show for the spending. While we were gathering financial evidence, Sandra made the situation worse by filing a false police report claiming that Grandpa had threatened her during a phone conversation. She alleged that he had become increasingly angry and aggressive, suggesting that his age-related mental decline was making him dangerous to be around. The police report was clearly intended to create legal justification for the eviction and to discourage any future contact between Grandpa and Roger's family. The accusations were completely fabricated. Grandpa had only called their house twice since being forced to leave both times, simply asking if he could retrieve some personal items he had forgotten during his hurried departure. Both calls had been brief and polite, with Grandpa accepting Sandra's refusal without argument or raising his voice. However, the false police report allowed Sandra to petition for a restraining order that would legally prevent Grandpa from approaching their property or contacting them directly. If successful, this would eliminate any possibility of family reconciliation and would support their narrative that Grandpa was mentally unstable and potentially violent. The stress from these escalating attacks on his character and reputation began taking a serious toll on Grandpa's health. He developed pneumonia in late November, requiring hospitalization for 5 days. The infection was probably brought on by the combination of physical exhaustion, emotional trauma, and the disruption to his normal routines and medical care. During his hospital stay, I met Maria Gonzalez, a social worker specializing in elder abuse cases. Maria had been assigned to evaluate Grandpa's situation after emergency room staff noted inconsistencies between his calm, rational demeanor and the family conflict described in Sandra's restraining order petition. Maria's training had taught her to recognize signs of financial exploitation and emotional abuse among elderly patients, and several aspects of Grandpa's case raised immediate red flags. The sudden displacement from his living situation, combined with the loss of financial resources and social isolation, fit classic patterns of systematic elder abuse designed to gain control of assets. After interviewing Grandpa privately, Maria became convinced that he was the victim rather than the perpetrator of family dysfunction. She documented his clear mental state, consistent storytelling, and reasonable emotional responses to genuinely traumatic treatment. Her professional assessment would become crucial evidence for challenging Sandra's false allegations. During this same period, I discovered that Roger had been making threatening phone calls to me, apparently trying to discourage my involvement in Grandpa's affairs. He left voicemails suggesting that I was interfering in private family matters and that my support for Grandpa was causing unnecessary drama and expense for everyone involved. "Alberta, you need to stop filling your grandfather's head with ideas about lawsuits and family conflicts," Roger said in one recorded message. "He's an old man who doesn't understand business or legal matters. The best thing for everyone would be if he accepted his situation and moved into assisted living where professionals can take care of his needs properly." These messages revealed Roger's strategy for dealing with potential opposition to his treatment of Grandpa. He wanted to frame any resistance as coming from outside agitators rather than legitimate concerns about his own behavior. By suggesting that Grandpa was incapable of making his own decisions, Roger hoped to position himself as the responsible family member making difficult but necessary choices about elder care. But Harold's most significant discovery came when he investigated the legal documents surrounding Grandpa's original decision to give Roger the inheritance money. Harold had maintained financial records for the ranch sale and remembered that Grandpa had mentioned setting up additional protections for his assets, separate from the money he planned to give Roger immediately. After searching through Grandpa's papers more carefully, Harold found references to a trust fund that had been established 20 years earlier with a different bank. The trust had been funded with proceeds from some smaller property sales and royalty payments from mineral rights on the original ranch land. Over 2 decades with careful investment management, this separate account had grown to approximately $2 million. The trust documents specified that the funds were protected from creditors, family disputes, and exploitation. Most importantly, they named me as the executor and primary beneficiary upon Grandpa's death, with specific instructions that the money should be used to continue my education and establish financial security for my future. Grandpa had created this protection during a period when he was already concerned about Roger's financial responsibility and character development. Even 20 years ago, he had recognized warning signs about his son's relationship with money and had quietly taken steps to ensure that some family resources would be preserved for future generations, regardless of Roger's choices. The existence of this trust fund meant that Roger's exploitation had been even more unnecessary and greedy than we realized. He had destroyed his relationship with his father and committed multiple crimes to steal money that represented only a portion of Grandpa's total assets. If he had simply honored his original agreement to care for Grandpa respectfully, he would have eventually inherited significant additional wealth through proper legal channels. But Roger had no knowledge of the protected trust fund, and his desperation to access every available dollar had led him to commit fraud and elder abuse for money he was never entitled to receive immediately. The hospital nurse who discovered Roger's attempt to change Grandpa's medical directive during his pneumonia treatment provided the final piece of evidence we needed to understand the full scope of his criminal intentions. Roger had approached hospital staff claiming that Grandpa had asked him to update his do not resuscitate orders, making them more restrictive to avoid unnecessary suffering during any future medical emergencies. The proposed changes would have prevented doctors from using several life-saving interventions that might have allowed Grandpa to recover from treatable conditions. If the directive had been updated as Roger requested, and if Grandpa had experienced another health crisis, Roger would have been able to claim that he was simply honoring his father's wishes about end-of-life care. The timing of this attempted manipulation coming immediately after Roger learned about the criminal investigation into his construction company finances revealed his true intentions. He was planning to accelerate Grandpa's death in order to claim any remaining inheritance before federal prosecutors could freeze his assets as part of their investigation. Fortunately, the nursing staff followed proper protocols for verifying such changes and discovered that Grandpa had never made any requests about updating his medical directives. Their intervention prevented what could have amounted to attempted murder disguised as compassionate elder care. As all these discoveries accumulated, I realized that Roger's betrayal of his father was not simply greed or convenience, but part of a systematic criminal enterprise designed to steal every possible asset while eliminating the only witness who could expose his crimes. The gentle, trusting man sleeping in our living room had unknowingly become the target of someone willing to commit any crime necessary to cover up his financial corruption. Harold and I had gathered enough evidence to demand justice, but we still had no idea how many other people were involved in Roger's criminal network, or how far he would go to protect himself once he realized that his crimes were being exposed. Meeting with Thompson's replacement attorney, Sarah Mitchell, opened up the final pieces of the puzzle that revealed just how extensively Roger had planned his exploitation of Grandpa. Sarah had taken over Thompson's practice after he was forced into early retirement, and she immediately recognized signs of the legal manipulation that had facilitated Roger's crimes. Thompson had left detailed notes about his concerns regarding the timing and circumstances of Grandpa's decision to transfer the inheritance money immediately. His documentation revealed that Roger had pressured him to schedule the signing meeting while Grandpa was still recovering from surgery, despite Thompson's professional recommendation to wait until Grandpa was completely alert and off pain medication. More troubling, Thompson's notes indicated that Roger had threatened to file a legal malpractice lawsuit if Thompson delayed the transaction. Roger claimed that any hesitation or additional scrutiny would damage his relationship with the ranch buyer and could cost the family millions of dollars in lost opportunity. Thompson, approaching retirement and unwilling to risk his reputation on a complicated family dispute, had reluctantly proceeded with the document signing despite his misgivings. Sarah also discovered that Roger had hired aggressive attorney Blake Morrison to replace Thompson specifically because Morrison was known for facilitating questionable financial transactions without asking difficult questions about client motivations or family dynamics. Morrison's practice specialized in helping wealthy clients restructure assets quickly, often to avoid tax implications or legal complications. The pattern suggested that Roger had planned his exploitation of Grandpa months in advance, systematically removing ethical oversight and creating legal conditions that would allow him to access the money with minimal scrutiny or delay. My regular conversations with Trust Administrator Catherine Wells revealed even more disturbing details about Grandpa's longtime concerns regarding Roger's character and financial responsibility. The trust fund had been established specifically because Grandpa had witnessed Roger's poor money management during his early adulthood and wanted to ensure that some family wealth would be preserved regardless of his son's future decisions. 20 years earlier, Roger had already demonstrated patterns of overspending, borrowing beyond his means, and treating family resources as personal entitlements rather than shared responsibilities. Grandpa had hoped that age and experience would help Roger develop better judgment, but he had quietly prepared for the possibility that his son would never learn to handle money responsibly. The trust documents included specific language protecting the funds from exploitation fraud or undue influence by family members who might seek to manipulate the grantor during periods of vulnerability or declining health. Grandpa had literally anticipated the exact situation that Roger eventually created and had taken legal steps to prevent it 20 years before it happened. This foresight revealed that Grandpa's decision to give Roger the ranch money had been a final test of his son's character, with the protected trust fund serving as insurance against the worst possible outcome. Grandpa had genuinely hoped that Roger would honor his commitments and prove worthy of future inheritance, but he had prepared for the disappointment that ultimately occurred. During our private conversations in the hospital, Grandpa shared his deepest regrets about his role in creating the conditions that allowed Roger's betrayal to occur. He admitted that his fear of dying alone and being forgotten had influenced his willingness to overlook warning signs about Roger's motivations and character. "I spent so much time building something that would last beyond my lifetime," Grandpa told me during one of our evening talks. "The ranch, the family traditions, the values I tried to pass down. But somewhere along the way, I failed to teach Roger that relationships are more important than money and that real security comes from treating people with dignity and respect." Grandpa also confessed that he had enabled Roger's sense of entitlement throughout his childhood and young adulthood, giving him money to solve problems instead of requiring him to develop his own problem-solving skills and work ethic. The pattern of financial rescue had continued into Roger's business ventures, with Grandpa providing loans and investment capital that Roger had never properly repaid or acknowledged. "I created a monster by teaching him that family resources were his birthright, rather than something to be earned through loyalty and responsibility," Grandpa said with tears in his eyes. "When I gave him that inheritance money, part of me knew I was making the same mistake again, but I wanted so desperately to believe that he had finally learned to value something besides money." Roger escalated his pressure campaign during this period, apparently recognizing that his crimes were being discovered and documented by people who could not be intimidated or bought off. He threatened to file an eviction lawsuit against me, claiming that allowing Grandpa to live in my apartment violated the terms of my rental lease and created liability issues for my landlord. He also began spreading lies about Grandpa's mental capacity to distant relatives, claiming that age-related dementia was making Grandpa paranoid and prone to making false accusations against family members who were trying to help him. These lies were designed to undermine any legal testimony Grandpa might provide and to create family pressure for me to stop supporting his version of events. Most aggressively, Roger filed a court petition seeking legal guardianship over Grandpa, claiming that his advanced age and recent health problems made him incapable of managing his own affairs or making rational decisions about his living situation. The guardianship petition was supported by a medical evaluation from Dr. Phillips, who claimed that Grandpa showed signs of cognitive decline and emotional instability that made him vulnerable to manipulation by outside influences. The medical evaluation was completely fraudulent. Dr. Phillips had never examined Grandpa in person and had based his assessment entirely on Roger's written descriptions of concerning behaviors and symptoms. The evaluation violated multiple medical ethics standards and was clearly intended to provide legal justification for taking away Grandpa's autonomy and decision-making rights. If the guardianship petition had been successful, Roger would have gained legal authority to make all decisions about Grandpa's housing, medical care, and financial affairs. He could have forced Grandpa into institutional care, prevented him from maintaining relationships with supportive family members, and gained access to any remaining assets, including the trust fund. Harold's investigation into Dr. Phillips revealed that he had a history of providing questionable medical evaluations for legal proceedings, often without conducting proper examinations or following standard diagnostic procedures. Phillips appeared to operate a side business helping wealthy clients obtain medical documentation to support their legal strategies, regardless of whether the documentation reflected legitimate health concerns. The network of corruption surrounding Roger's crimes was expanding to include multiple professionals who were willing to violate their ethical obligations in exchange for financial compensation. Blake Morrison, Dr. Phillips, and several other individuals had apparently helped Roger create a system for exploiting elderly family members while maintaining legal cover for their actions. But the most shocking discovery came when private investigator Tony Rodriguez, hired by Sarah Mitchell, uncovered Roger's backup plan for dealing with any legal challenges to his treatment of Grandpa. Roger had been researching substandard nursing home facilities in distant states, planning to transfer Grandpa to a location where he would have no local support system and minimal oversight of his treatment. The facilities Roger had contacted were known for accepting patients with complex legal situations and for maintaining minimal communication with outside family members. Some of these institutions had histories of abuse allegations and regulatory violations, but they offered the kind of isolation and control that Roger needed to continue his exploitation without interference. Roger's plan involved using the fraudulent guardianship to relocate Grandpa immediately, then systematically transferring any remaining assets to offshore accounts that would be difficult for investigators to trace or recover. The international transfers would have made it nearly impossible for federal prosecutors to recover stolen funds even after proving that crimes had been committed. The scheme was sophisticated enough to suggest that Roger had received professional advice about how to hide stolen money and eliminate witnesses who could expose financial crimes. His willingness to essentially disappear his own father in order to protect his criminal enterprise revealed a level of callousness that went beyond simple greed or poor judgment. As I sat beside Grandpa's hospital bed during his recovery from pneumonia, watching him struggle to understand how his own son could have become capable of such calculated cruelty, I realized that our legal battle was about much more than recovering stolen money or ensuring proper elder care. We were fighting to prove that elderly people deserve dignity and protection rather than exploitation and abandonment, and that family relationships should be based on love and respect rather than financial manipulation and control. The evidence we had gathered was strong enough to stop Roger's crimes and hold him accountable for his actions, but I knew that the real justice would come from ensuring that Grandpa's final years were filled with the security, respect, and genuine family connection that he had tried to purchase through his generosity. Working with Sarah Mitchell to expose the full extent of Roger's criminal network revealed connections that reached far beyond what we had initially imagined. The investigation uncovered a coordinated conspiracy involving multiple professionals who had created a systematic approach to elder financial abuse that could be applied to vulnerable families throughout our community. The handwriting analysis that Sarah commissioned proved conclusively that Roger had forged Grandpa's signature on at least 6 different legal documents, including the updated will that named Roger as sole beneficiary and executor. The forensic examination showed clear differences in pen pressure letter formation and signature rhythm that could not have resulted from natural changes in Grandpa's handwriting due to age or illness. The forged documents represented Roger's attempt to override Grandpa's original estate planning and gain legal control over assets that were supposed to be protected through the trust fund and other arrangements. If Roger had succeeded in establishing legal authority over all of Grandpa's finances, he could have systematically drained every account while claiming that he was acting according to his father's documented wishes. Blake Morrison, Roger's attorney, had apparently helped create several of these fraudulent documents using legal letterhead and official language that would have made them difficult for non-lawyers to identify as forgeries. Morrison's involvement elevated Roger's crimes from individual acts of elder abuse to organized criminal conspiracy involving officers of the court. The investigation also revealed that Dr. Phillips had provided false medical evaluations for at least 12 other elderly patients over the past 3 years, always supporting family members who sought to gain financial control over their relatives' assets. Phillips's clients had paid him between $5,000 and $10,000 for each fraudulent evaluation, generating over $100,000 in illegal income from his participation in elder abuse schemes. James Patterson, the banker who had processed several questionable transactions from Grandpa's accounts, had also facilitated similar financial exploitation for other elderly customers. Patterson had developed a system for helping family members access their relatives' accounts without proper documentation, often by creating false emergencies that required immediate cash withdrawals. Patterson's involvement allowed Roger and other criminals to access funds quickly while avoiding the scrutiny that larger financial institutions typically applied to unusual account activity involving elderly customers. The bank's internal audit eventually revealed over 40 suspicious transactions that Patterson had approved without following proper verification procedures. The most disturbing aspect of this criminal network was its systematic approach to targeting vulnerable elderly people who had significant assets but limited social support systems. The criminals had developed profiles identifying ideal victims based on recent deaths of spouses, geographic isolation from extended family, and evidence of cognitive decline or physical health problems that might affect their ability to resist manipulation. Roger's treatment of Grandpa was not an isolated incident of family greed, but part of a coordinated criminal enterprise that had probably victimized dozens of families throughout our region. The network included medical professionals who provided false documentation, legal professionals who created fraudulent paperwork, financial professionals who facilitated illegal transfers, and family members who served as the primary contact points for identifying and accessing vulnerable targets. During this period, we also learned that several former ranch employees had been trying to contact Grandpa for months, hoping to discuss Roger's broken promises about future employment opportunities. When Roger purchased the ranch from the development company, he had assured longtime workers that his construction business would provide jobs for anyone interested in transitioning from agricultural work to building trades. These workers had sold their homes and relocated their families based on Roger's commitments, only to discover that he had no intention of hiring them and had never even submitted their applications for employment. The false promises had caused genuine financial hardship for multiple families who had trusted Roger's word about their economic future. Maria Santos, whose husband Carlos had worked on the ranch for 15 years, told me that Roger had collected detailed personal information from all the interested workers, including Social Security numbers, previous employment records, and financial information about their family situations. This data collection had been presented as part of the employment application process, but the information was never used for legitimate business purposes. Instead, Roger had apparently sold the personal information to identity thieves who targeted the former ranch workers and their families for credit card fraud and other financial crimes. The workers had experienced a series of unexplained credit problems and fraudulent account activity in the months following their contact with Roger about employment opportunities. This revelation showed that Roger's criminal activities extended beyond exploiting his own father to include deliberate victimization of hardworking families who had depended on the ranch for their livelihoods. He had used his knowledge of their economic vulnerability to facilitate additional crimes that caused lasting financial damage to people who had trusted his family for years. The broader impact of Roger's crimes became even more apparent when we discovered that he had been systematically overcharging clients for his construction services, often by claiming that projects required expensive materials or extensive labor that was never actually provided. His business practices had evolved from simply poor workmanship to deliberate fraud designed to generate cash flow for covering his gambling debts and other financial obligations. Several of Roger's former clients had filed complaints with the Better Business Bureau and the State Contractor Licensing Board, but Roger had avoided serious consequences by making partial refunds and promising to correct defective work that he never actually completed. The pattern of complaints showed escalating financial desperation that probably motivated his decision to accelerate the timeline for exploiting Grandpa's inheritance. Hospital nurse Patricia Williams, who discovered Roger's attempt to alter Grandpa's medical directives, provided crucial testimony about the suspicious timing and content of Roger's requests. Patricia had worked in elder care for over 20 years and had developed expertise in recognizing signs of family members who might be planning to harm elderly relatives for financial gain. Roger's behavior during Grandpa's hospitalization had raised immediate red flags for Patricia and her colleagues. He had asked detailed questions about hospital procedures for notifying family members about patient deaths, had inquired about typical timelines for probate proceedings following a patient's passing, and had seemed unusually interested in ensuring that Grandpa's medical treatment would not be unnecessarily prolonged. Patricia's documentation of these conversations provided evidence that Roger was actively planning for Grandpa's death and was trying to ensure that any inheritance proceedings would move forward quickly without legal complications or family disputes. Combined with the attempted changes to medical directives, Roger's hospital behavior suggested preparation for what could have amounted to assisted suicide or medical murder. The federal investigation into Roger's construction company finances revealed the final pieces of his criminal enterprise. The missing pension fund money had been systematically stolen over a period of 18 months, with Roger using increasingly sophisticated methods to hide the theft from company accountants and federal oversight agencies. Roger had created false invoices for non-existent construction projects, claimed fraudulent tax credits for environmental improvements that were never made, and had even established shell companies to receive payments for work that was never performed. The missing $400,000 represented only a portion of his total theft from the company, with additional irregularities suggesting that over $800,000 had been stolen from various sources. The federal prosecutors explained that Roger would likely face multiple felony charges, including elder abuse, fraud, forgery, identity theft, embezzlement, and potentially attempted murder depending on how the medical directive situation was ultimately classified. The extensive documentation we had gathered would support criminal prosecution at both state and federal levels, with possible sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years in prison. But beyond the legal consequences, the investigation had revealed that Roger's crimes represented a fundamental betrayal of every value and relationship that should define family connection. He had not simply stolen money from his father, but had attempted to destroy an elderly man's dignity, security, and will to live in order to cover up his own criminal incompetence and greed. As I watched Grandpa slowly regain his strength during his recovery from pneumonia, I realized that exposing Roger's crimes was only the first step toward healing the damage he had caused. The real challenge would be rebuilding Grandpa's faith in family relationships and ensuring that his final years were filled with the genuine love and respect that he deserved. The federal investigation into Roger's construction company embezzlement created a domino effect that quickly expanded beyond his business crimes to encompass all aspects of his systematic financial fraud. Special Agent Catherine Chen, who led the investigation, explained that elder financial abuse cases involving multiple victims often revealed broader patterns of criminal behavior that required comprehensive prosecution strategies. When federal agents executed search warrants on Roger's home business and bank accounts, they discovered evidence of crimes that went far beyond what we had documented through our private investigation. Computer files revealed detailed records of his gambling activities, including losses that exceeded $300,000 over the previous 2 years, far more than we had initially calculated. The search also uncovered Roger's personal planning documents for accelerating Grandpa's death, including research about untraceable methods for inducing heart attacks in elderly people with existing health conditions. Roger had apparently been consulting online forums about elder care and medical procedures, seeking information that could help him cause Grandpa's death while avoiding suspicion from medical professionals or law enforcement. These discoveries elevated the charges against Roger to include conspiracy to commit murder, transforming what had begun as a financial crime investigation into a potential homicide case. The federal prosecutors explained that Roger's systematic planning to end his father's life in order to claim inheritance money represented one of the most calculated and vicious elder abuse cases they had encountered. As news of the investigation became public, Sandra immediately distanced herself from Roger's crimes by filing for divorce and cooperating fully with law enforcement. Her attorney provided testimony revealing that Roger had threatened her family with financial ruin and physical violence if she refused to support his treatment of Grandpa or if she disclosed any information about his criminal activities. Sandra's cooperation revealed additional details about Roger's systematic intimidation tactics and his escalating desperation as his crimes began to unravel. She described instances when Roger had threatened to harm her children if she interfered with his financial schemes and occasions when he had physically prevented her from contacting family members who might have questioned his treatment of Grandpa. Her testimony painted a picture of a household dominated by Roger's increasingly paranoid and violent behavior as his criminal enterprise faced exposure. Sandra and her children had been living in fear of Roger's unpredictable outbursts and had been actively planning their own escape from his control when the federal investigation provided them with protection and legal support. The asset seizure that accompanied the criminal charges resulted in immediate freezing of all Roger's financial accounts and the repossession of items purchased with stolen money. The luxury boat was seized and sold at auction with proceeds designated for victim restitution. The expensive truck was similarly repossessed, and the family home was scheduled for foreclosure proceedings to recover additional stolen funds. Roger's attempts to hide money in offshore accounts proved unsuccessful as federal investigators had been monitoring his financial activities for several weeks before executing the arrests. The international transfers that Roger had planned as his escape strategy actually provided additional evidence of his criminal intent and resulted in enhanced charges related to money laundering and tax evasion. During this period, Grandpa's health began to stabilize with proper medical care and the relief of knowing that his situation was finally being addressed through appropriate legal channels. The stress and trauma of Roger's abuse had taken a significant toll on his physical condition, but removing the threat of further exploitation allowed him to focus on recovery and healing. Community support for Grandpa emerged from unexpected sources as news of Roger's crimes spread throughout our area. Former ranch employees, church members, local business owners, and neighbors organized a support network that provided practical assistance with transportation meals, medical appointments, and social companionship. The outpouring of genuine concern and affection from people who had known Grandpa for decades provided powerful evidence that he was respected and valued by his community, contrary to Roger's claims that he was a burden whom nobody wanted to help. The support fund organized by his friends raised over $15,000 to help cover medical expenses and living costs during his recovery. Mary Henderson, who had been Grandpa's church organist for over 40 years, coordinated a visitation schedule that ensured he had meaningful social contact every day. The regular visitors included people from many different aspects of his life: former ranch workers, church members, business associates, neighbors, and family friends who had maintained their affection and respect for him, despite Roger's attempts to isolate him from his social connections. These relationships revealed that Grandpa had built a legacy of kindness and integrity that extended far beyond his immediate family. His generosity toward the ranch workers, his support for community projects, and his mentorship of younger farmers had created genuine bonds that survived despite Roger's efforts to destroy his reputation and social standing. When Roger was formally arrested on federal charges, his final attempt at reconciliation with Grandpa demonstrated the complete disconnect between his actions and his understanding of the damage he had caused. Roger called Grandpa from jail, claiming that his crimes had been motivated by financial desperation rather than malice, and asking for forgiveness and family support during his legal proceedings. Roger seemed genuinely surprised that Grandpa refused to provide bail money or character testimony for his defense. He appeared to believe that family loyalty should override his systematic abuse and exploitation, and that Grandpa should prioritize Roger's immediate needs over his own safety and dignity. Grandpa's response to Roger's requests demonstrated the quiet strength and moral clarity that had allowed him to build a meaningful life despite his son's betrayal. "I forgive you because holding anger would hurt me more than you," Grandpa told Roger during their final phone conversation. But forgiveness does not mean pretending that your actions were acceptable or that you deserve help escaping the consequences of your choices. Grandpa also maintained appropriate boundaries with other family members who attempted to minimize Roger's crimes or pressure him to provide financial support for Roger's legal defense. Several distant relatives suggested that family problems should be resolved privately rather than through criminal prosecution, but Grandpa firmly rejected attempts to frame his exploitation as a personal dispute rather than a series of serious crimes. The private investigator hired by our legal team uncovered the final element of Roger's criminal planning that demonstrated the true scope of his willingness to harm his father for financial gain. Roger had been researching methods for transferring Grandpa to nursing home facilities that operated with minimal oversight and had histories of allowing patients to die from neglect or deliberate mistreatment. The facilities Roger had contacted specialized in accepting patients with complex legal situations and maintaining minimal communication with outside family members. Some of these institutions had been cited for abuse violations and had staff members with criminal records, but they offered the isolation and control that Roger needed to complete his exploitation without interference from law enforcement or concerned relatives. Roger's plan involved using fraudulent guardianship documents to relocate Grandpa to one of these distant facilities, then allowing or facilitating his death through medical neglect, while claiming that age-related decline was the natural cause. The institutional setting would have provided cover for what amounted to a planned murder designed to look like natural death due to advanced age and health problems. The sophistication of this planning revealed that Roger had moved far beyond opportunistic theft to become someone capable of methodical planning for his father's murder. His transformation from ungrateful son to calculating killer represented a level of moral corruption that shocked even experienced law enforcement professionals who had investigated numerous elder abuse cases. As I watched Grandpa participate in the community activities and social relationships that Roger had tried to destroy, I realized that justice in this case required more than simply punishing Roger's crimes. True justice meant restoring Grandpa's dignity, security, and faith in human relationships after experiencing the ultimate betrayal from someone who should have been his protector. The final phase of our legal battle would focus on ensuring that Grandpa's remaining years were filled with the genuine love, respect, and family connection that he had tried to secure through his generous gift of the ranch inheritance. 3 months after Roger's arrest, Grandpa passed away peacefully in my presence on a quiet Tuesday morning in February. The pneumonia had weakened his lungs more than we had realized, but his final weeks were filled with exactly the kind of dignity, family connection, and community respect that he had hoped to find when he made his original decision to sell the ranch. Instead of dying alone in some distant nursing home facility where Roger had planned to abandon him, Grandpa spent his final days surrounded by people who genuinely loved and respected him. Harold visited every afternoon to share stories about their decades of friendship. Mary Henderson brought him recordings of church services when he became too weak to attend in person. Former ranch workers stopped by to express their gratitude for his years of fair treatment and community leadership. The will reading took place on a cold but bright morning in early March, with snow covering the ground outside Sarah Mitchell's office windows. The assembled group included me, Harold, several distant relatives who had maintained contact with Grandpa, despite Roger's efforts to isolate him, and representatives from various community organizations that had benefited from Grandpa's lifetime of quiet generosity. Roger was not present as he remained in federal custody, awaiting trial on multiple felony charges. Sandra attended as a divorced former family member primarily to ensure that her children would not be held responsible for any of Roger's debts or legal obligations. The reading revealed the true wisdom of Grandpa's estate planning and his ultimate understanding of the difference between family members who deserved his trust and those who had forfeited their right to benefit from his life's work. The trust fund that he had established 20 years earlier provided me with resources to complete my graduate education and purchase a home, ensuring that his investment in my future would continue beyond his death. The will also included substantial donations to organizations that had demonstrated genuine care for elderly community members. The local hospital received $50,000 specifically designated for expanding their elder abuse prevention programs. The church received funds for maintaining their transportation service that helped elderly members attend services and community events. Most meaningfully, Grandpa had established a scholarship fund at the community college for students pursuing careers in agriculture, with preference given to applicants from families with limited financial resources. The scholarship honored the ranch workers who had shown loyalty and integrity throughout their employment and ensured that future generations would have opportunities to build careers in the agricultural traditions that had defined his life's work. The personal items distributed through the will reflected Grandpa's thoughtful consideration of relationships that had provided genuine meaning during his final years. Harold received Grandpa's woodworking tools and his collection of agricultural journals spanning 40 years of ranch management. Mary Henderson received his grandmother's piano, which had been in storage since the ranch sale, but which Grandpa knew would be treasured by someone who truly understood its musical and sentimental value. Several former ranch employees received specific tools and equipment that Grandpa knew they would use productively in their own agricultural pursuits. These gifts demonstrated his continued concern for their economic welfare and his desire to support their efforts to build independent livelihoods after losing their employment due to the ranch sale. Roger's inheritance consisted of a single symbolic dollar and a letter that Grandpa had written during his final weeks. The letter expressed Grandpa's disappointment and sadness about Roger's choices, but also included forgiveness and hope that Roger would eventually learn to value relationships and integrity over money and material possessions. I pray that your time in prison will provide you with the opportunity to examine your life and discover better ways to find meaning and security, Grandpa had written. The money you stole from me was only money, but the damage you caused to your own character and to our family relationships represents a much greater loss that only you can choose to repair. The letter avoided vindictive language or expressions of anger, instead focusing on Grandpa's genuine concern for Roger's spiritual and emotional well-being. Even after experiencing the ultimate betrayal, Grandpa had maintained his fundamental belief in redemption and personal growth, though he had also ensured that Roger would face appropriate consequences for his crimes. The federal criminal trial concluded 6 months later with Roger's conviction on 17 felony counts, including elder abuse fraud, forgery embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit murder. The evidence we had helped gather, combined with additional discoveries made during the federal investigation, provided overwhelming proof of his systematic crimes against multiple victims. Roger received a sentence of 25 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 12 years. The judge specifically noted the calculated nature of his crimes and his willingness to harm vulnerable elderly people for financial gain. The sentence reflected not only punishment for his actions, but also protection for other potential victims who might have been targeted by his criminal enterprise. Asset recovery efforts resulted in the return of approximately $1.8 million to Grandpa's estate, representing partial compensation for the money Roger had stolen. While the full $5 million could never be recovered due to Roger's gambling losses and other wasteful spending, the returned funds provided additional resources for the charitable donations and family bequests outlined in Grandpa's will. Blake Morrison, the attorney who had facilitated Roger's document forgeries, was disbarred and sentenced to 8 years in prison for his role in the elder abuse conspiracy. Dr. Phillips received a 12-year sentence and lost his medical license permanently for providing fraudulent medical evaluations that enabled financial exploitation of elderly patients. The broader criminal network that had targeted elderly victims throughout our region was systematically dismantled, with law enforcement agencies using information from Roger's case to identify and prosecute additional criminals who had been operating similar schemes in other communities. 1 year after Grandpa's death, I attended the dedication ceremony for the Walter McCready Memorial Scholarship at our local community college. The first recipients included 2 young women pursuing degrees in sustainable agriculture and 1 young man planning to study agricultural business management with a focus on family farm preservation. Standing in the college courtyard on that sunny spring afternoon, surrounded by community members who had known and respected Grandpa for decades, I felt a deep sense of completion and justice that went far beyond the legal victories we had achieved. Roger's crimes had been exposed and punished, but more importantly, Grandpa's true legacy of kindness, integrity, and community service had been preserved and would continue to benefit future generations. The memorial garden that Harold and I planted behind the college library included roses, herbs, and vegetables that represented the agricultural traditions Grandpa had spent his lifetime developing and protecting. The garden would be maintained by scholarship recipients as part of their practical education, ensuring that Grandpa's knowledge and values would be passed down through direct mentorship and hands-on learning. As I knelt to plant the final rose bush in the memorial garden, I remembered Grandpa's words from one of our last conversations about the difference between building something meaningful and simply accumulating wealth. "Money comes and goes," he had told me, "but the relationships you build, the values you demonstrate, and the kindness you show to people when they are vulnerable, those things last forever and create a legacy that nobody can steal." Roger had focused entirely on stealing money and had destroyed every relationship that might have provided him with genuine security and meaning. Grandpa had given away his wealth, but had retained the love and respect of everyone who truly knew him, creating a legacy that would continue to benefit our community for decades to come. The final irony of Roger's crimes was that his desperate attempt to secure financial advantage had cost him far more than money could ever be worth. He had traded his freedom, his family relationships, his reputation, and his integrity for temporary access to wealth that brought him no lasting satisfaction or security. If you have ever faced a situation where someone you trusted betrayed that trust for money or personal gain, I would love to hear how you handled it and what advice you might have for others dealing with similar challenges. Please share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe for more stories about family relationships, justice, and standing up for what is right. Thank you for listening to Grandpa's story and for caring about the welfare of elderly people who deserve our protection and respect. I hope his experience will inspire you to cherish the people in your life who have earned your trust and to remain vigilant against those who might try to exploit vulnerability for their own selfish purposes. Remember that real wealth comes from building relationships based on love, respect, and mutual support, and that the most valuable inheritance we can leave for future generations is a legacy of integrity and compassion that will guide them long after we are gone.